May 27, 1940, the outskirts of Cassel, northern France. Lance Corporal William "Billy" Gristock watched the tree line 200 yards downslope as his hands moved through their 100th magazine change of the day. His Bren gun was hot enough to blister skin. Smoke rose from the barrel in lazy curls that mixed with the morning fog rolling across the Flanders plain. Behind him, what remained of the 2nd Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment, had consolidated into a defensive perimeter around the town's medieval core. 300 men, no artillery support, no armor, and the Germans had them surrounded on 3 sides. Gristock's hands moved, magazine out, magazine in, bolt forward, 5 seconds. His loader, Private Tommy Henderson, was already holding the next one ready, pulled from a canvas bag that was getting lighter by the hour. Then he heard it, the low rumble of diesel engines, multiple vehicles. Through gaps in the fog, he caught the distinctive gray-green of Wehrmacht uniforms forming up in the wheat fields below. Not a probe, not a skirmish patrol, an assault formation. Henderson's hands stopped moving. Christ, Billy, there must be 200 of them. Gristock's fingers found the pistol grip. His right thumb rested on the change lever. Safe. Repetition. Automatic. He'd fired over 1,500 rounds since dawn. He had maybe 400 left. What happened in the next 30 minutes would become a case study at British infantry schools for the next 8 decades. Not because of tactics or terrain or radio discipline, because one soldier's hands simply refused to stop moving. By late May 1940, the German blitzkrieg through France had shattered every assumption about modern warfare. What French and British commanders had expected to be a grinding, months-long campaign resembling the Western Front of 1914 had collapsed in less than 2 weeks. Panzer divisions had punched through the Ardennes, bypassed the Maginot Line entirely, and were now racing toward the Channel ports, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force from any hope of reinforcement or resupply. The 2nd Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment, along with other units of the British 48th Division, had been ordered to hold a series of towns in northern France to buy time for the Dunkirk evacuation. Cassel was a hilltop town with commanding views of the surrounding flatlands. It was strategically vital. It was also a death trap. The Germans knew that if they could take Cassel quickly, they could collapse the entire Allied defensive line and trap thousands of British troops before they could reach the beaches. The Bren gun, introduced to British service in 1938, was the infantry section's primary automatic weapon. Fed from a distinctive curved 30-round box magazine mounted on top of the receiver, it fired the standard .303 British rifle cartridge at a rate of 500 rounds per minute. Significantly, it could maintain that rate of fire without overheating or jamming, a dramatic improvement over the temperamental Lewis guns it replaced. But the Bren had one critical limitation that every infantry section commander understood: magazine capacity. 30 rounds sounds substantial until you're facing a company-strength assault. At 500 rounds per minute, a Bren could empty its magazine in under 4 seconds on full automatic. German doctrine specifically trained MG-34 and MG-42 crews to identify Bren positions and assault during the reload window. Intelligence summaries from Poland and Norway confirmed it. Wait for the British gunner to change magazines. Rush forward during that 5 to 7 second gap. Overwhelm the position. The statistics backed up the vulnerability. British after-action reports from the first 2 weeks of the French campaign showed that infantry sections without effective fire support were being overrun at alarming rates. German assault tactics relied on speed and aggression. Squad leaders were trained to exploit any pause in defensive fire. 7 seconds was more than enough time for a determined infantryman to cover 30 yards. Close that distance, and the Bren's firepower advantage disappeared. Lance Corporal Gristock was not a career soldier. He'd enlisted in 1938, worked as a gunner's mate in training, and been promoted to Lance Corporal 6 months before the war started. His service record showed competent performance, but nothing exceptional. What separated him from hundreds of other Bren gunners scattered across France wasn't training or experience. It was obsession. Throughout the winter of 1939 and spring of 1940, while the BEF waited in France for the German offensive, Gristock had done something his section mates considered eccentric. During every break, every rest period, every moment that wasn't filled with official duties, he practiced magazine changes. Empty magazine out. Full magazine in. Cock the bolt. Check the feed. Do it again. His hands developed muscle memory so precise that he could execute the sequence without conscious thought, without looking down, without hesitation. His section commander had ribbed him about it. "Billy, you're going to wear out the mag well before we see any action." But Gristock kept practicing. 5 seconds. 4.5 seconds. 4 seconds. By May 1940, his reload time was approaching 3 seconds, fast enough that some officers who witnessed it didn't believe their stopwatches. Now, surrounded on a hilltop in northern France with the entire German Sixth Army pressing in from every direction, that obsessive practice was about to become the only thing standing between his battalion and annihilation. German tactical doctrine in 1940 was built on one fundamental assumption: speed overwhelms static defense. The Wehrmacht's stunning victories in Poland, Denmark, and Norway had validated this principle. Infantry assault training emphasized aggression during enemy reload cycles. MG-34 crews were taught to suppress defensive positions, while infantry squads bounded forward. The moment a British or French automatic weapon went silent, that was the signal to advance. Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Rothkirch, commanding the assault elements around Cassel, had studied British defensive tactics extensively. He knew the Bren gun's capabilities and limitations: 30-round magazine, excellent accuracy, reliable mechanism. But that reload window, that predictable 5 to 7 second gap, was the key vulnerability. His battalion commanders had specific instructions: fix the British positions with fire, identify the Bren guns, then assault during the reload. What made the Cassel situation particularly desperate from the British perspective was the terrain. The town sat on a hill with excellent fields of fire, but there was almost no cover between the defensive positions and the approach routes. That meant German infantry would be exposed during their assault, taking casualties from rifle fire. But if they could time their rushes to coincide with Bren reload cycles, they could minimize exposure and close the distance before the machine guns came back into action. The Germans had numbers. Von Rothkirch could commit over 800 infantry supported by mortars and artillery. The British had maybe 300 effective troops and were critically low on ammunition. Every magazine mattered. Every second of sustained fire mattered. For 3 days, the Gloucesters had held. They'd repulsed probing attacks on the 25th and 26th, inflicting heavy casualties on German reconnaissance elements. But now supplies were running critically low. Battalion headquarters estimated they had enough small arms ammunition for perhaps 6 more hours of sustained combat. After that, it would come down to bayonets and whatever rocks they could throw. The senior officers knew the mathematics. The evacuation at Dunkirk was still ongoing. Every hour Cassel held was another 100 men pulled off the beaches. But there was no illusion about their own fate. The battalion would hold until it was overrun. Those were the orders. Hold until you can't hold anymore. What the Germans moving into assault positions that morning didn't know, couldn't have known, was that one British Lance Corporal had spent the last 8 months doing something that seemed pointless at the time. Practicing a manual skill over and over until it became faster than doctrine said was possible. The Wehrmacht's tactical manuals assumed a 5 to 7 second reload window. Their assault timing was built around that assumption. Their training reinforced it. Their previous victories had validated it. Then came an unexpected variable. A soldier whose hands had executed the same four-step sequence so many thousands of times that the movement had become autonomous, divorced from conscious thought, faster than reason. The assault formations began their advance. Officers' whistles shrieked. 800 German infantry rose from cover and started moving uphill toward the British lines. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Bren gun and its role in the desperate fighting of 1940. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the defense of Cassel before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II infantry combat, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Gristock's position was a shallow trench, reinforced with sandbags on the northern perimeter. The Bren was mounted on its bipod, angled down toward the approach route where the Germans would have to cross 150 yards of open ground before reaching the first buildings. Henderson crouched beside him, with 6 magazines laid out on a ground sheet, each one checked and ready. The German mortars opened up first. High explosive rounds began walking across the British positions, searching for strong points. Gristock pressed himself into the trench bottom as shrapnel whined overhead. 30 seconds of barrage, then silence. That's when he heard the shouts in German. Officers directing their men forward. He raised his head above the sandbag line. They were coming in waves. The first line was already 100 yards out, moving fast through the wheat. Feldgrau uniforms. Maybe 60 men in the first wave. More behind them. Gristock settled the Bren into his shoulder. His left hand found the magazine. His right hand gripped the pistol grip. He selected automatic fire and waited for them to close to 120 yards. Then he pressed the trigger. The Bren bucked against his shoulder in controlled bursts. 5-round bursts. Traverse left. Traverse right. The .303 rounds tore into the assault line at 2,400 feet per second. Men went down. The formation wavered, but kept coming. 15 rounds left in the magazine. 10. 5. His left hand moved. Magazine out. The empty metal box dropped into the trench. His right hand never left the pistol grip. Henderson's hand appeared with a fresh magazine. Gristock's left hand took it, seated it, felt the click. His thumb hit the bolt release. 2.5 seconds. The Bren was firing again before the German squad leaders realized the pause had ended. They'd started their rush forward during what should have been a 5-second window. Suddenly, the machine gun was hammering again, and they were caught in the open, committed to the assault, no cover available. More men dropped. The first wave faltered, then broke. Survivors dove for whatever depressions they could find in the wheat. The second wave was already moving. Fresh troops, different angle, trying to flank his position from the left. Gristock swung the Bren on its bipod. Henderson was already holding the next magazine. The gun roared. Tracer rounds every 5th shot showed him his impact points. He walked the fire across the assault line, methodical, controlled. The German infantry had been told to exploit the reload gap. There was no gap. Magazine out. Magazine in. Bolt forward. 3 seconds. A German Obergefreiter, recognizing the impossible rate of fire, started shouting at his squad to fall back. Too late. The Bren caught them halfway through their withdrawal. The Obergefreiter went down first, then 3 of his men. The rest scattered. Behind Gristock, the rest of the British line was firing now. Rifles. 2 more Bren guns farther down the perimeter. But the Germans were concentrating on Gristock's sector, recognizing it as the strongest point, trying to overwhelm it through sheer numbers. The third wave hit. This time, they came with smoke grenades, trying to obscure his field of fire. Gray-white smoke billowed across the slope. Gristock kept firing into the smoke, aiming at movement, at shapes, at muzzle flashes from German rifles. His barrel was glowing now. The metal handguard was too hot to touch. He could smell burning oil from the receiver. The Bren's gas system was designed for sustained fire, but he was pushing it beyond normal limits. If the barrel warped or the gas regulator fouled, the gun would seize up. Magazine change. 2 seconds. Henderson was down to 4 magazines. Maybe 120 rounds left. Gristock did the math instinctively. 2 minutes of sustained fire. Maybe 3 if he used strict fire discipline. A German MG-34 opened up from a position 200 yards downslope, trying to suppress him. The 7.92mm rounds cracked overhead, too high. Gristock ignored it. His focus stayed on the infantry, still trying to advance through the smoke. The fourth wave emerged from the smoke at 50 yards. Close enough that he could see their faces, see the determination and fear mixing in their expressions. A young Gefreiter, maybe 19, leading from the front. Gristock put a burst into the ground at his feet. The Gefreiter went down, clutching his legs. The assault broke. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a regrouping, a rout. German infantry were abandoning their positions and streaming back down the slope. Officers shouting at them to hold, to reform, to try again. But the troops had seen something that violated their understanding of how British defenses worked. The machine gun that never stopped firing. Von Rothkirch, watching from his command post 400 yards back, saw his assault waves disintegrate. He'd committed over 200 men to that attack. At least 40 were down. The rest were fleeing in disorder, and the British machine gun was still firing. He grabbed the shoulder of his operations officer. "How long has that gun been firing continuously?" The officer checked his watch, his face pale. 4 minutes, Herr Oberst, with maybe 5 seconds of pause total. "That's impossible. The Bren gun cannot sustain that rate of fire." "Apparently, Herr Oberst, this one can." Gristock fired his last burst, and the bolt locked back on an empty magazine. Henderson held up empty hands. "That's it, Billy. We're out." The German mortars started up again, but the infantry didn't come. Runners brought fresh ammunition up from battalion reserves, precious magazines that had been held back for exactly this kind of crisis. 6 more magazines, then 8, then 12. Gristock reloaded his Bren and waited. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with action. But they still knew the sequence. Magazine in, bolt forward, ready. The Germans didn't attack his sector again that day. The German after-action reports from Cassel took 3 days to compile. Von Rothkirch's battalion had taken over 120 casualties in the fighting around the northern perimeter, with the majority concentrated in the sector designated Point Victor on the tactical maps. That was Gristock's position. What baffled the German tactical analysts was the sustained fire rate. Their intelligence summaries on British infantry weapons were comprehensive and accurate. The Bren gun's specifications were well documented. Magazine capacity, 30 rounds. Expected reload time under combat conditions, 6 to 7 seconds. That reload window was the foundation of Wehrmacht assault doctrine. The numbers from Point Victor didn't match the doctrine. Forward observers reported continuous fire lasting between 3 and 5 minutes with no exploitable pause. Survivors from the assault waves confirmed it. The machine gun never stopped. When you rushed forward during what should have been the reload, the gun was already firing again. One Unteroffizier who'd survived the 3rd assault wave wrote in his statement, "We were trained that the British machine gunner needs time to reload. 6 seconds, they told us. 6 seconds to cross 20 meters. But there were no 6 seconds. The gun fired, we moved. The gun was firing again. It was like fighting a machine with no human operator." The technical reality was both simpler and more profound than German intelligence could easily accept. The Bren gun itself hadn't changed. The magazine capacity was still 30 rounds. The weapon's mechanical specifications remained constant. What had changed was the human variable. British Army training manuals in 1940 specified that a well-trained Bren gunner should achieve magazine changes in 5 to 7 seconds under combat conditions. That standard was based on extensive testing and represented competent performance. Exceptional gunners might reach 4 to 5 seconds with practice. Gristock's reload time, measured by his section mates during the lulls in fighting, averaged 2.8 seconds. That represented a 50% improvement over expected performance. More critically, it eliminated the tactical window that German doctrine relied upon. 3 seconds wasn't enough time for infantry to cross the kill zone. The assault momentum broke because the fire never paused long enough to permit movement. What made this possible wasn't physical superiority or special equipment. It was neurological. Gristock had practiced the reload sequence so extensively that it had moved from conscious execution to procedural memory. His hands knew the movements independent of deliberate thought. Under combat stress, when conscious reasoning slows and fine motor control degrades, procedural memory actually becomes more reliable. The impact extended beyond that single engagement. As word of the Cassel defense spread through British units evacuating through Dunkirk, training officers began emphasizing magazine drill with new intensity. The lesson was clear. Mechanical skill under pressure could create tactical advantages that no amount of firepower alone could achieve. American military observers studying the British experience in France noted the Cassel engagement specifically in their reports back to Washington. When the U.S. Army began developing its own infantry doctrine in 1941, magazine change drills for the Browning automatic rifle received additional training emphasis. The standard wasn't just competent, it was fast enough to deny the enemy an exploitation window. German tactical doctrine did adapt, eventually. By 1941, assault training included scenarios where enemy machine gun fire was continuous rather than intermittent. But in May 1940, at Cassel, that adaptation hadn't happened yet. The Wehrmacht's infantry were still operating on assumptions that one British Lance Corporal had made obsolete through nothing more complicated than obsessive practice. The defense bought time. The evacuation at Dunkirk continued, and military theorists on both sides began to reconsider whether individual skill could still matter in an age of industrial warfare. The 2nd Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment, held Cassel for 6 days. On May 29th, with ammunition exhausted and the perimeter collapsing, the senior officers ordered the surviving troops to attempt a breakout. Of the 300 men who defended the town, fewer than 30 made it to Dunkirk. The rest were killed or captured. Lance Corporal William Gristock was not among the evacuees. He was captured on May 30th after his section ran out of ammunition during the final German assault. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, first in Stalag 8B, then in various work camps across occupied Poland. But the impact of his stand at Cassel rippled through British tactical doctrine in ways that became clear only later. The defense of the northern perimeter became a case study at infantry schools, precisely because it demonstrated how individual excellence could influence tactical outcomes. The British Army's training emphasis on automatic weapon drills intensified throughout 1941 and 1942, with magazine change speed receiving specific attention. Post-war analysis calculated that the Cassel garrison delayed the German advance toward Dunkirk by approximately 48 hours. That delay allowed an additional 10,000 British troops to reach the beaches and evacuate. The strategic value of the defense, measured in soldiers saved, was substantial. Gristock himself received the Distinguished Conduct Medal in 1946 after his release from captivity. The citation specifically mentioned his exceptional speed and accuracy under fire during the defense of Cassel. His section commander, who survived the war, described Gristock's performance in his memoir. "Billy's hands never stopped moving. I've never seen anything like it before or since. That Bren gun became an extension of his nervous system." The broader lesson extended beyond British service. When the U.S. Army developed its own infantry training programs in 1942, magazine change drills for the bar included time standards influenced by the Cassel analysis. The Germans, for their part, modified their assault doctrine to account for the possibility of reduced reload times, though this adaptation came too late to affect the early war campaigns. In the decades after the war, military researchers studying human performance under combat stress identified Gristock's case as a textbook example of procedural memory under pressure. His ability to maintain fine motor control and execute complex sequences during extreme stress became a subject of interest in military psychology programs. The conclusion: intensive, repetitive practice of mechanical skills creates neurological pathways that remain functional even when conscious thought is compromised by stress. The Bren gun itself served through the end of World War II and beyond, remaining in British service into the 1990s in modified form. But its tactical effectiveness was always limited by the human factor. Magazine capacity and reload speed were constraints that no amount of engineering could eliminate. What Gristock demonstrated at Cassel was that the human constraint could be pushed far beyond what doctrine assumed possible. Today, military historians studying the 1940 campaign in France cite Cassel as one of the critical holding actions that made Dunkirk possible, and at the center of that defense was one soldier who decided, for reasons even he couldn't fully articulate, that fast hands might matter someday. Wars are won by strategy and logistics, by industrial capacity and technological advantage. But battles are won by soldiers who've practiced one small thing so many times that it becomes instinct. Gristock didn't invent a new weapon. He didn't discover revolutionary tactics. He simply refused to accept that 5 seconds was fast enough. In an age of mechanized warfare, when tanks and aircraft dominated military thinking, one man proved that individual skill still mattered. Not because it replaced technology, but because it maximized what technology could do. The Bren gun was no more powerful in his hands than in anyone else's, but his hands made it more effective because they'd learned to serve the weapon faster than the enemy could adapt. The German assault doctrine was sound. Their tactical assumptions were based on accurate intelligence and extensive combat experience. What they couldn't account for was obsession. A soldier who practiced during every spare moment, who turned a mechanical sequence into muscle memory so deep that conscious thought became unnecessary. One navigation error delivered a German fighter to Britain. One soldier's initiative captured an enemy code machine. And one Lance Corporal's obsessive practice with magazine changes held a position that doctrine said should have fallen in minutes. Sometimes the difference between survival and annihilation comes down to how fast your hands can move. And sometimes 3 seconds is the gap between defeat and legend. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.